Patrick Kearney, known as the Trash Bag Killer, was an American serial killer who murdered at least 21 young men and boys between 1962 and 1977 in Southern California, targeting vulnerable victims like hitchhikers and men from gay bars whom he would shoot in the head before engaging in necrophilia and dismembering their bodies, which he then disposed of in trash bags along highways, earning him his notorious nickname. Patrick Wayne Kearney was born on September 24, 1939, in East Los Angeles, California. From the very beginning, life seemed stacked against this small, sickly child who would grow up to become one of California's most prolific serial killers. He was the youngest of 3 boys in what appeared to be a stable middle-class family, with parents George and Eunice Kearney, who tried their best to provide a normal upbringing. But beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary household, the seeds of something terrible were already taking root. As a child, Patrick was thin and frail, which made him an easy target for the cruel playground politics that governed childhood. The bullies at school saw his weakness like sharks smelling blood in the water. They would torment him relentlessly, calling him names and beating him up whenever they got the chance. The other children would use homophobic slurs against him, even though he was just a child trying to find his place in the world. These daily humiliations cut deep into Patrick's developing psyche, creating wounds that would never properly heal. The bullying was not just physical, but emotional and psychological too. Patrick felt completely powerless against his tormentors, unable to fight back or defend himself because of his small size and weak constitution. This feeling of helplessness would stay with him for the rest of his life, festering like an infected wound that refused to close. As he grew older, Patrick began to retreat into himself, becoming more and more isolated from his peers. He spent long hours alone in his room, fantasizing about getting revenge on those who had hurt him. When Patrick was 13 years old, something happened that would change the course of his life forever. His father decided it was time to teach his son how to slaughter pigs, a skill that was still common in rural areas during that time. George Kearney took Patrick out to the family property and showed him how to kill a pig by shooting it from behind the ear. The bullet would penetrate the brain instantly, causing immediate death without suffering. Patrick watched with fascination as the life drained out of the animal's eyes. This moment was like a switch being flipped in Patrick's mind. The power he felt in that instant, the control over life and death, was intoxicating. It was the first time in his young life that he had felt truly powerful, truly in control of something. The memory of that pig's death would stay with him forever, becoming the template for the murders he would commit years later. He began to fantasize about killing people, imagining himself as the one with the gun, the one with the power to decide who lived and who died. As Patrick entered his teenage years, he became increasingly withdrawn and antisocial. While other boys his age were playing sports or chasing girls, Patrick was lost in dark fantasies of murder and revenge. He would imagine killing the bullies who had tormented him, picturing their faces as the life left their eyes. These fantasies became more detailed and elaborate over time, playing out in his mind like movies that he could watch over and over again. Patrick's academic performance was actually quite good despite his psychological problems. He was intelligent and showed particular aptitude for mathematics and engineering. His teachers saw him as a quiet, well-behaved student who kept to himself but did his work diligently. They had no idea about the violent fantasies that consumed his thoughts or the darkness that was growing inside him like a cancer. During his teenage years, Patrick also began to realize that he was different from other boys in another way. He found himself attracted to males rather than females, which, in the 1950s, was something that had to be kept secret at all costs. Homosexuality was not just socially unacceptable, but was actually illegal in most places. This realization added another layer of shame and isolation to Patrick's already troubled psyche. He felt like he was fundamentally broken, different from everyone else in ways that could never be fixed. After graduating from high school, Patrick decided to join the United States Air Force. This was partly an attempt to escape his troubled past, and partly a desire to prove his masculinity to himself and others. Military service was seen as the ultimate test of manhood, and Patrick hoped that it would somehow cure him of his dark thoughts and forbidden desires. The structure and discipline of military life appealed to him, offering a chance to start over with a clean slate. Patrick's time in the Air Force was relatively uneventful on the surface. He served competently and without major incident, learning skills that would later serve him well in civilian life. However, the military did not cure him of his psychological problems as he had hoped. If anything, the strict hierarchy and authoritarian structure of military life may have reinforced his feelings of powerlessness and resentment. The violent fantasies continued to play out in his mind, growing more detailed and specific over time. It was during his military service that Patrick first began to act on his homosexual desires, though he was extremely careful to keep this hidden from his superiors and fellow servicemen. The military's strict policies against homosexuality meant that discovery would result in immediate discharge and public humiliation. Patrick learned to compartmentalize his life, presenting one face to the world while hiding his true nature beneath a carefully constructed facade. After completing his military service, Patrick returned to California and enrolled in college to study electrical engineering. He was a dedicated student who threw himself into his studies with the same intensity that he brought to everything else. Engineering appealed to his methodical, analytical mind, and he excelled in his coursework. His professors saw him as a serious, hardworking student with real potential for success in the field. During his college years, Patrick began to develop the skills and knowledge that would later make him such an effective killer. His engineering studies taught him about electronics, mechanics, and problem-solving techniques that could be applied to any situation. He learned how to think systematically and methodically, breaking down complex problems into manageable components. These skills would serve him well when he began planning and executing his murders years later. Patrick also began to explore his sexuality more openly during college, though he remained extremely discreet about it. He would venture into the underground gay scene in Los Angeles, frequenting bars and clubs where he could be himself without fear of discovery. However, even in these supposedly safe spaces, Patrick remained guarded and suspicious. His experiences with bullying and rejection had left him unable to trust anyone completely, even those who might have understood and accepted him. After graduating from college, Patrick found work as an electrical engineer at Hughes Aircraft Company, a major aerospace contractor based in Southern California. Hughes Aircraft was a prestigious company that worked on cutting-edge military and civilian projects, and landing a job there was a significant achievement for a young engineer. Patrick's colleagues saw him as a competent, reliable worker who kept to himself, but did quality work. His supervisors described him as a model employee who never caused trouble or drew attention to himself. The work at Hughes Aircraft was challenging and engaging, providing Patrick with an outlet for his intellectual abilities and a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life. He worked on various electronics projects, applying his engineering skills to solve complex technical problems. The job paid well and provided financial security, allowing Patrick to live comfortably and independently for the first time in his life. However, success at work could not fill the emptiness that had been growing inside Patrick for years. Despite his professional achievements, he remained deeply lonely and isolated. He had few friends and no close relationships, spending most of his free time alone in his apartment. The violent fantasies that had started in childhood continued to plague his thoughts, becoming more frequent and intense as the years passed. Patrick's first serious romantic relationship began in the mid-1960s when he met David Hill, a younger man who would become his long-term partner. David was different from Patrick in many ways, more outgoing, more emotional, and more willing to take risks. Their relationship was passionate but turbulent, marked by frequent arguments and dramatic reconciliations. Patrick found himself both drawn to and frustrated by David's mercurial personality. The relationship with David provided Patrick with companionship and physical intimacy, but it also brought new stresses and complications into his life. Patrick was not good at emotional intimacy, and often felt overwhelmed by David's needs and demands. When they fought, which was often, Patrick would retreat into himself, shutting down emotionally and becoming cold and distant. These periods of conflict were particularly difficult for Patrick, triggering his old feelings of powerlessness and rage. It was during one of these relationship conflicts in 1962 that Patrick committed his first murder. The details of this killing would set the pattern for all the murders that followed. Patrick had been arguing with David and feeling particularly frustrated and angry when he decided to go for a ride on his motorcycle to clear his head. He rode out to a secluded area outside of Indio, California, where he encountered a 19-year-old hitchhiker who was looking for a ride. Patrick offered the young man a ride, and they rode together to an isolated spot in the desert. Once they were alone and far from any witnesses, Patrick pulled out a gun and shot the hitchhiker in the head, just as his father had taught him to kill pigs years before. The young man died instantly, and Patrick immediately felt a rush of power and control that was more intense than anything he had ever experienced. For the first time since childhood, he felt truly in control of his own destiny. After killing the hitchhiker, Patrick sexually assaulted the corpse, fulfilling the dark fantasies that had been building in his mind for years. The combination of murder and necrophilia provided him with a level of satisfaction and release that normal sexual activity could never match. This first killing was like a drug to Patrick, creating an addiction that would drive him to kill again and again over the next 15 years. The body of Patrick's first victim was never found, buried somewhere in the vast California desert where it was consumed by carrion-eating animals and the elements. Patrick returned home feeling calmer and more in control than he had in months. David noticed the change in his mood, but had no idea what had caused it. Patrick had discovered the perfect outlet for his rage and frustration, and he would return to it whenever the pressures of life became too much to bear. Later that same year, Patrick killed again, this time targeting the younger cousin of his first victim. The cousin had witnessed Patrick driving away with the first victim and had begun asking questions about his relative's disappearance. Patrick saw this as a threat to his security and decided that the boy had to be eliminated. He lured the 16-year-old to the same isolated location where he had killed before and shot him in the head in the same manner as his first victim. Patrick's third murder of 1962 involved another young man named Mike, who was 18 years old. Like the others, Mike was shot in the head and then sexually assaulted after death. Patrick was developing a clear pattern in his killings, a methodology that satisfied his psychological needs while minimizing the risk of discovery. He was learning to be an efficient killer, applying the same systematic approach that he used in his engineering work to the business of murder. For the next few years, Patrick managed to control his homicidal urges, focusing on his work at Hughes Aircraft and his relationship with David. However, the violent fantasies never stopped, and the memory of those first 3 killings continued to provide him with a source of secret satisfaction. He would replay the murders in his mind during quiet moments, remembering the feeling of absolute power that came with taking a life. In 1965, Patrick killed again, this time in Orange County, California. The details of this murder are sparse, but it followed the same pattern as his earlier killings. Patrick was becoming more confident and methodical in his approach, learning from each murder and refining his techniques. He was also becoming more selective in choosing his victims, targeting young men who fit a specific profile that satisfied his psychological needs. Patrick's most significant murder during this early period occurred around Christmas of 1968, when he killed a young man known only as George in his Culver City apartment. This murder was different from the others because it took place in Patrick's own home, requiring much more careful planning and cleanup. Patrick lured George to his apartment under false pretenses, then shot him in the head moments after he entered the house. After killing George, Patrick dragged the body to his bathroom, where he engaged in necrophilia before beginning the process of dismembering the corpse. Using an X-Acto knife, Patrick carefully skinned and dismembered George's body in the bathtub, taking care to extract the bullet from the victim's head to prevent the murder from being traced back to him. He then buried the dismembered remains behind his garage, where they would remain hidden for nearly a decade. The murder of George marked a turning point in Patrick's killing career. For the first time, he had brought a victim to his own home and successfully disposed of the evidence without detection. This gave him confidence in his abilities and showed him that he could kill with impunity as long as he was careful and methodical in his approach. However, the close proximity of the crime to his daily life also made him more paranoid about discovery, and he did not kill again for over a year. During this quiet period, Patrick continued his work at Hughes Aircraft and maintained his relationship with David, though both were increasingly strained by the pressures of his secret life. Patrick was becoming more withdrawn and secretive, spending long hours alone, and showing little interest in normal social activities. David began to suspect that something was wrong, but had no idea about the true nature of Patrick's dark secret. Patrick's relationship with David became increasingly volatile during the early 1970s. Their arguments grew more frequent and intense, often escalating to the point where one or both of them would storm out of the house. It was during these periods of conflict that Patrick felt most compelled to kill, using murder as a way to regain control and vent his frustrations. The pattern was always the same. After a fight with David, Patrick would go out hunting for victims, returning home hours later feeling calmer and more centered. In June 1971, David left Patrick after a particularly bitter argument, leaving behind only a note explaining his decision. This abandonment triggered something in Patrick that would change him forever. The loss of his primary relationship, combined with his existing psychological problems, pushed him over the edge into a period of sustained killing that would last for the next 6 years. Patrick's murder spree had officially begun. The murders that followed David's departure were more frequent and more brutal than anything Patrick had done before. He began killing on an almost monthly basis, targeting young men and boys who fit his preferred victim profile. Most of his victims were hitchhikers or men he picked up at gay bars, vulnerable individuals who would not be missed immediately or whose disappearances could be easily explained. Patrick's methodology became increasingly refined during this period. He developed a system for picking up victims, killing them, and disposing of their bodies that was both efficient and difficult to trace. He would typically drive around in his Volkswagen Beetle, looking for suitable targets along highways or in areas known for prostitution and drug activity. Once he had selected a victim, he would offer them a ride or engage them in conversation until he could get them alone. The actual killings followed a consistent pattern that Patrick had perfected over years of practice. He would typically shoot his victims in the temple above the ear with a small .22 caliber Derringer pistol, often while driving. The small caliber bullet was less likely to exit the skull, reducing the amount of blood and making cleanup easier. Patrick could kill his victims while driving with his left hand on the steering wheel and his right hand holding the gun, maintaining normal speed and appearance to avoid suspicion from other drivers. After killing his victims, Patrick would drive to a secluded location where he could engage in necrophilia with the corpses. This was the primary motivation for his murders, the sexual gratification he derived from having complete control over another person's body. Patrick was not interested in torturing or terrorizing his victims while they were alive. He simply wanted access to their bodies after death. The killing was just a means to an end, a necessary step in fulfilling his deviant sexual desires. Once Patrick had satisfied his sexual needs, he would begin the process of dismembering and disposing of the bodies. He had studied the methods used by other serial killers, particularly Dean Corll and his accomplices in the Houston mass murders, and had learned efficient techniques for body disposal. Patrick would use a hacksaw to cut the bodies into manageable pieces, often draining the blood first to reduce odor and prevent detection. The dismembered body parts would then be placed in heavy-duty trash bags, which gave Patrick his nickname of the Trash Bag Killer. He would scatter these bags in various locations throughout Southern California, often along highways or in remote desert areas where they might not be discovered for weeks or months. Some body parts were thrown into landfills, while others were left in areas where wild animals would consume them, further destroying evidence. Patrick's attention to detail in disposing of bodies was remarkable. He would often wash the body parts before bagging them to remove fingerprints and other trace evidence. He would also sometimes beat the corpses after death as a way of venting his anger and frustration, seeing this as a form of cathartic exercise that helped him maintain emotional balance. Many of his victims resembled the bullies who had tormented him in childhood, suggesting that his murders were partly motivated by a desire for revenge against those who had made him feel powerless. As Patrick's killing spree continued, he became increasingly bold and confident in his abilities. He began targeting younger victims, including children, which added an extra layer of horror to his crimes. One of his most shocking murders was that of 5-year-old Ronnie Dean Smith, who disappeared on August 24, 1974, and was found dead in the woods 2 months later. Patrick had smothered the child and then disposed of his body like all the others, showing that his capacity for evil knew no bounds. The murder of children represented a new low even for Patrick. Ronnie Dean Smith was just an innocent little boy who had done nothing to deserve such a fate. Patrick's ability to kill a child showed that he had completely lost touch with any sense of morality or human decency. He had become a predator in the truest sense of the word, viewing other human beings as nothing more than objects to be used for his own gratification. Patrick's work life continued normally throughout this period, with his colleagues at Hughes Aircraft having no idea that their quiet, unassuming coworker was one of California's most prolific serial killers. Patrick maintained his professional facade with remarkable skill, compartmentalizing his life so completely that his two worlds never intersected. During the day, he was a respected engineer working on important defense projects. At night, he was a killer stalking the highways of Southern California. The only person who might have suspected something was wrong was Jerry Stevens, the owner of a local grocery store where Patrick frequently shopped. Stevens noticed that Patrick would often purchase butcher knives, carefully examining them and asking about the quality of the steel. He described Patrick as a loner with an eerie sense of quiet about him, but even Stevens had no idea about the true purpose behind Patrick's knife purchases. By the mid-1970s, Patrick had killed at least 20 people and was showing no signs of slowing down. His confidence in his abilities had grown to the point where he felt virtually untouchable by law enforcement. He had developed an efficient system for finding, killing, and disposing of victims that had served him well for over a decade. However, this confidence would ultimately prove to be his downfall. Patrick's method of victim selection had remained fairly consistent throughout his killing career. He preferred young men and boys, usually between the ages of 5 and 28, who were vulnerable and unlikely to be missed immediately. Many of his victims were hitchhikers, runaways, or men involved in prostitution or drug use. These were people on the margins of society, individuals whose disappearances might not trigger intensive police investigations. The geographic scope of Patrick's murders was vast, covering multiple counties throughout Southern California. He would often drive long distances to dispose of bodies, sometimes crossing state lines into Nevada or Arizona. This wide distribution of crime scenes made it difficult for law enforcement agencies to recognize patterns or coordinate their investigations. Each agency was dealing with what appeared to be isolated incidents rather than recognizing them as part of a larger pattern. Patrick's victims came from diverse backgrounds, but they all shared certain characteristics that appealed to his psychological needs. Many of them were young, blonde, and physically attractive, the same type of person who had bullied him in his youth. This suggested that his murders were partly motivated by a desire for revenge against those who had made him feel inadequate and powerless. By killing people who resembled his tormentors, Patrick was symbolically striking back at everyone who had ever hurt him. The sexual component of Patrick's crimes was central to his motivation. Unlike some serial killers who derive pleasure from the act of killing itself, Patrick was primarily interested in having access to his victims' bodies after death. This necrophilic behavior was the driving force behind his murders, with the killings themselves being merely a means to an end. Patrick was careful to kill his victims quickly and efficiently, without torture or prolonged suffering, because he was not a sadist in the traditional sense. Patrick's ability to maintain his double life for so many years was remarkable. To his co-workers, neighbors, and casual acquaintances, he appeared to be a normal, if somewhat introverted, man living a quiet life. He paid his bills on time, maintained his property, and never caused any trouble that would draw attention to himself. This facade of normalcy was crucial to his success as a serial killer, allowing him to operate undetected for over a decade. The psychological toll of maintaining this double life was enormous, however. Patrick was under constant stress from the need to keep his crimes secret while continuing to function in normal society. He became increasingly paranoid and suspicious, constantly watching for signs that he might be under suspicion. This paranoia was justified, as law enforcement agencies throughout Southern California were beginning to notice patterns in the disappearances and murders that suggested the work of a serial killer. By 1976, police agencies in several counties had begun to coordinate their investigations into what they were calling the trash bag murders, or freeway killings. The discovery of multiple victims whose bodies had been dismembered and placed in trash bags was too unusual to be coincidental. Investigators were beginning to develop a profile of the killer, though they still had no idea who he was or where he might strike next. Patrick was aware that law enforcement was closing in, but he was unable to stop killing. The compulsion to murder had become too strong to resist, and he continued to take victims even as the risk of discovery increased. His final murder spree included some of his most brazen killings, suggesting that he was either becoming reckless or was deliberately courting capture as a way of ending his torment. One of Patrick's most notorious victims during this period was 13-year-old Michael Craig McGee, who disappeared on June 16, 1976. McGee was a troubled boy with a history of juvenile delinquency who had been hitchhiking when Patrick picked him up. Patrick claimed that he had befriended the boy and invited him on a camping trip to Lake Elsinore, but then decided that McGee posed a threat to his security and killed him without warning. Patrick told investigators that he had disposed of the body in such a way that you aren't going to find him, and McGee's remains were never recovered. Another significant victim was 8-year-old Merle Hondo Chance, who vanished on April 6, 1977, while riding his bicycle near Patrick's workplace. Patrick claimed that he had smothered the boy, taken his body home overnight, and then disposed of the remains in the Angeles National Forest. Chance's decomposed body was discovered on May 26, 1977, making him Patrick's last known victim before his arrest. The murder that ultimately led to Patrick's downfall was that of 17-year-old John Otis LeMay, whom he killed on March 13, 1977. LeMay had told a neighbor that he was going to Redondo Beach to meet a man named Dave whom he had met at a local gym. This was actually David Hill, Patrick's former partner, who had given LeMay the address to Patrick's home. When LeMay arrived at the house, Hill was not there, but Patrick invited him in to watch television while they waited. Without any provocation, Patrick impulsively reached for his pistol and shot LeMay in the back of the head. This murder was different from the others because it took place in Patrick's own home and because there were witnesses who could connect LeMay to both Patrick and David Hill. After killing LeMay, Patrick dismembered the body and dumped the remains in the desert, but the damage had already been done. When LeMay's dismembered remains were discovered on March 18, 1977, police immediately began investigating his last known activities. The trail quickly led them to David Hill and then to Patrick Kearney. For the first time in his killing career, Patrick had left a clear trail of evidence that pointed directly to him. The careful planning and methodical approach that had protected him for so many years had been abandoned in favor of an impulsive killing that would prove to be his undoing. The investigation into LeMay's murder moved quickly once police had identified Patrick and David as suspects. On June 3, 1977, warrants were issued for their arrest on suspicion of multiple murders. By this time, investigators had connected Patrick to at least 8 killings and suspected that there were many more. The media began referring to the case as the trash bag murders, and Patrick's photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout the region. Patrick and David were aware that the police were closing in on them. They had seen the increased police presence in their neighborhood and knew that it was only a matter of time before they were arrested. On the advice of their families, they decided to surrender rather than try to evade capture. On July 1, 1977, they walked into the Riverside County Sheriff's Office, pointed to their pictures on a wanted poster, and simply said, "We're them." The surrender of Patrick Kearney marked the end of one of the most prolific killing sprees in California history. Over a period of 15 years, he had murdered at least 21 people and possibly as many as 43. His victims ranged in age from 5 to 28, and their bodies had been scattered across multiple counties in Southern California. The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of his crimes and provide closure for the families of his victims. David Hill was quickly cleared of any involvement in the murders and was released from custody. Despite being Patrick's longtime partner and having lived with him during much of the killing spree, investigators concluded that Hill had no knowledge of the crimes and was not involved in any way. This was likely true, as Patrick had been extremely careful to keep his 2 lives completely separate, and Hill had probably been as shocked as anyone to learn about his partner's secret activities. Patrick, meanwhile, began cooperating with investigators almost immediately after his arrest. Perhaps realizing that the evidence against him was overwhelming, or perhaps feeling relief at finally being caught, he provided detailed confessions to multiple murders. Initially, he admitted to killing 28 victims, but later added 7 more to avoid the death penalty. In exchange for his cooperation and guilty pleas, prosecutors agreed not to seek capital punishment. The confessions that Patrick provided were remarkable for their detail and matter-of-fact tone. He described his crimes with the same methodical precision that he had brought to his engineering work, providing investigators with information about victim selection, killing methods, and body disposal techniques. He showed no emotion as he recounted the murders, speaking about taking human lives as if he were discussing a technical problem at work. Patrick's willingness to confess to his crimes was partly motivated by his desire to avoid the death penalty, but it may also have been driven by a psychological need to finally tell someone about the secret that had dominated his life for so many years. Living with the knowledge of his crimes while maintaining a normal facade had been an enormous burden, and confession may have provided him with a sense of relief that he had not felt in decades. The legal proceedings against Patrick moved relatively quickly once he decided to cooperate. On December 21st, 1977, he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder in Riverside County and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 7 years. However, this was just the beginning of his legal troubles, as prosecutors in other counties also filed charges against him for murders committed in their jurisdictions. In February 1978, Patrick was charged with 18 additional counts of murder in Los Angeles County. Once again, he pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for life sentences rather than the death penalty. The total of 21 murder convictions made Patrick one of the most prolific serial killers in California history, surpassed only by Juan Corona, who was convicted of 25 murders. The sentencing of Patrick Kearney brought some measure of closure to the families of his victims, though nothing could truly compensate for their losses. Many of the victims were young men and boys who had their whole lives ahead of them, cut short by Patrick's selfish desires and psychological problems. The impact of his crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims to include their families, friends, and communities, all of whom were left to deal with the aftermath of his actions. Patrick was initially sentenced to multiple life terms with the possibility of parole, but the nature of his crimes and the number of victims made it highly unlikely that he would ever be released. As one prosecutor noted at the time, they hoped that the parole board never sees fit to parole Kearney as he appears to be a menace to humanity. This sentiment was shared by law enforcement officials and the public alike, who viewed Patrick as too dangerous to ever be released back into society. The investigation into Patrick's crimes continued even after his conviction, as law enforcement agencies tried to determine the full scope of his killing spree. He had confessed to 35 murders, but was only convicted of 21 due to lack of physical evidence in the other cases. Investigators suspected that the true number of victims might be even higher, possibly reaching into the 40s or beyond. Many of his early victims from the 1960s were never identified, and their bodies were never found. The case of Patrick Kearney had a significant impact on law enforcement practices in California and beyond. His ability to operate undetected for so many years highlighted the need for better coordination between different police agencies and the importance of recognizing patterns in seemingly unrelated crimes. The investigation also demonstrated the value of forensic evidence and scientific methods in solving complex cases. Patrick's crimes also had a broader social impact, contributing to public awareness of serial killers and the threat they pose to society. The case received extensive media coverage, and Patrick became one of the first serial killers to achieve national notoriety. His methodical approach to murder and his ability to maintain a normal facade while committing horrific crimes fascinated and terrified the public in equal measure. The psychological aspects of Patrick's case were particularly intriguing to researchers and law enforcement officials. His background as a successful engineer who seemed to live a normal life challenged stereotypes about what serial killers looked like. Patrick did not fit the profile of a crazed maniac or obvious deviant. Instead, he appeared to be an ordinary man who happened to harbor extraordinary darkness within himself. The role of childhood trauma in Patrick's development as a serial killer was extensively studied by psychologists and criminologists. His experiences with bullying, combined with his feelings of powerlessness and social isolation, were seen as contributing factors in his evolution from troubled child to mass murderer. However, researchers were careful to note that many people experience similar traumas without becoming killers, suggesting that Patrick's crimes were the result of a complex interaction of psychological, social, and biological factors. Patrick's relationship with David Hill also attracted significant attention from researchers. The fact that Hill lived with Patrick for many years without apparently knowing about his crimes raised questions about how well we can really know the people closest to us. It also highlighted Patrick's remarkable ability to compartmentalize his life and maintain different identities in different contexts. The geographic scope of Patrick's crimes made him part of a larger phenomenon known as the freeway killers, a term used by media and law enforcement to describe what they initially thought was a single serial killer operating in Southern California. It was later discovered that there were actually 3 separate killers: Patrick Kearney, William Bonin, and Randy Kraft, who were operating independently but targeting similar victims in similar areas. The Freeway Killers case demonstrated the challenges faced by law enforcement when dealing with serial crimes that cross multiple jurisdictions. Each agency was initially investigating what appeared to be isolated incidents, making it difficult to recognize the broader patterns that might have led to earlier arrests. This led to improved communication and coordination protocols that are still used today. Patrick's time in prison has been relatively uneventful compared to his years as a free man. He has been incarcerated at various facilities throughout California, currently residing at Mule Creek State Prison. He has generally been described as a model prisoner who causes no trouble and keeps to himself, much as he did during his working years at Hughes Aircraft. He has reportedly shown no remorse for his crimes and has expressed no interest in rehabilitation or therapy. The question of whether Patrick will ever be released from prison remains a subject of debate, though most experts agree that it is highly unlikely. Despite being technically eligible for parole consideration, the nature and scope of his crimes make it almost impossible to imagine a scenario where he would be deemed safe for release. The families of his victims and law enforcement officials continue to oppose any possibility of parole, viewing Patrick as a permanent threat to public safety. Patrick's case continues to be studied by researchers interested in understanding the psychology of serial killers. His combination of high intelligence, professional success, and extreme violence makes him a unique case study in the field of criminal psychology. His methodical approach to murder and his ability to evade detection for so many years provide insights into how some killers are able to operate successfully for extended periods. The impact of Patrick's crimes on the field of forensic science has been significant. The techniques used to identify his victims and link him to various crime scenes helped advance the use of scientific methods in criminal investigations. His case also highlighted the importance of preserving crime scenes and collecting physical evidence, even in cases where the connection to a broader pattern might not be immediately obvious. The media coverage of Patrick's case helped establish many of the conventions that are still used today when reporting on serial killers. His nickname, the Trash Bag Killer, was one of the first such monikers to achieve widespread recognition, setting a precedent for the dramatic names that would later be applied to other serial killers. The extensive coverage also helped educate the public about the reality of serial crime and the methods used by law enforcement to investigate such cases. Patrick's story serves as a reminder of the potential for evil that can exist within seemingly ordinary people. His ability to function normally in society while committing horrific crimes challenges our assumptions about how we identify and respond to dangerous individuals. It also highlights the importance of taking missing person cases seriously, particularly when they involve vulnerable populations like runaway youth or members of marginalized communities. The families of Patrick's victims have had to live with the aftermath of his crimes for decades. Many have become advocates for victims' rights and have worked to keep Patrick in prison by opposing any parole applications. Their ongoing efforts to ensure that Patrick remains incarcerated serve as a testament to their love for their lost family members and their determination to prevent him from harming anyone else. The investigation into Patrick's crimes also revealed significant problems with how missing person cases were handled during the 1960s and 1970s. Many of his victims were initially dismissed as runaways or troublemakers whose disappearances were not taken seriously by law enforcement. This led to reforms in how police agencies respond to missing person reports and increased awareness of the vulnerability of certain populations to predatory criminals. Patrick's case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and academic studies over the years. Each new examination of his crimes provides additional insights into his methods and motivations, contributing to our broader understanding of serial killing as a phenomenon. His story continues to fascinate researchers and the public alike, serving as a window into the mind of one of America's most prolific killers. The technological advances that have occurred since Patrick's arrest have made it much more difficult for serial killers to operate undetected for extended periods. DNA analysis, improved communication systems, and sophisticated database programs have given law enforcement tools that were not available during Patrick's active years. However, His case serves as a reminder that intelligence, planning, and careful attention to detail can still allow dangerous individuals to evade capture for significant periods. Patrick Kearney's story is ultimately one of wasted potential and unnecessary tragedy. He possessed intelligence and skills that could have been used to make positive contributions to society, but instead chose to use them in service of his darkest impulses. His victims were robbed of their lives and futures, their families left to grieve and wonder what might have been. The ripple effects of his crimes continue to be felt decades later, a lasting reminder of the damage that one person's evil can inflict on countless others. The case of Patrick Kearney stands as one of the most significant serial killing sprees in American history. His methodical approach to murder, his ability to evade detection for over a decade, and the scope of his crimes make him a unique figure in the annals of criminal history. While he has been imprisoned for nearly 50 years and is now an elderly man unlikely to ever be released, his story continues to provide valuable lessons about the nature of evil and the importance of vigilance in protecting society from dangerous individuals. As Patrick Kearney sits in his prison cell at Mule Creek State Prison, now in his 80s, he remains a reminder of the capacity for darkness that can exist within the human heart. His crimes shocked the nation and forever changed the lives of countless people, from the families of his victims to the law enforcement officials who worked to bring him to justice. His story serves as both a cautionary tale about the potential for evil in our midst and a testament to the dedication of those who work to protect society from predators like him. The legacy of Patrick Kearney, the trash bag killer, is one of horror and tragedy, but also of justice ultimately served. While nothing can undo the damage he caused or bring back the lives he took, his capture and conviction demonstrated that even the most careful and methodical killers can eventually be brought to justice. His story continues to inform our understanding of serial crime and serves as an important chapter in the ongoing effort to protect society from those who would do it harm. Today, Patrick Kearney remains behind bars, where he will likely spend the rest of his natural life. The young man who was once bullied and humiliated grew up to become one of America's most notorious killers, leaving a trail of death and destruction that spanned 15 years and claimed dozens of innocent lives. His story is a stark reminder that evil can wear a human face and that vigilance is the price of safety in a world where predators walk among us, hidden behind masks